This one's sort of a direct follow up from my previous video. I was discussing Mark Wallace's views in the Eye as to the perception of crime and how that impacts public thinking on this subject. Um, a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about here I have mentioned before, but I want to sort of summarize it, I guess, and bring it into one video. These are the things that I feel can improve our criminal justice system. Now, people may disagree with me. They may wish to add some things. They may wish to challenge some of these points. But this is what I feel can improve our justice system. There's probably more than this, but these are some things that do come to mind. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into it. The last video was a little bit lengthy, so go try and make this more condensed. I will try. Okay, we need to jail career criminals. This goes without saying. Career criminals make up almost half of all offences. So it makes absolute sense to jail them because that can significantly reduce crime. If judges are in a position where they're saying we're reluctant to jail people because of prison space, then prioritise career criminals. Too often we see situations where an offender has notched up offence after offence after offence, and they still avoid jail. And this is why I strongly disagree with Lord Timpson's attitude that we jail too many people. The opposite is arguably true, that too often career criminals avoid custody. I mean, I would challenge Lord Timpson. How does he answer that? You know, the fact that career criminals do escape custody, custodial sentences. I did contact him a while back via the House of Lords. No reply so far. To just challenge him on some of the positions he's come out with. Okay, more visible and tougher policing on the streets. This taps into what Mark Wallace was saying, because I think if you see a situation where there's someone stealing in a shop and then the police turn up and the evidence is assessed, i.e. they've been caught on CCTV, put them in handcuffs, lead them away, that will greatly reassure the public. Will it happen? Who knows? I will say one thing. I think that the big stores, you know, the Tesco's, the Sainsbury's, the Icelands, whilst they also have this problem, they are in a better position because they can afford security guards. They have CCTV. This isn't necessarily the case for smaller shops. So I do have a lot of sympathy for smaller businesses that have to put up with these callous thieves. And this isn't just desperate people trying to feed their drug habit. In many cases, these are organised gangs who will use violence to, you know, to feed that trade that they're involved in. This isn't always. I think there's a perception of a shoplifter as kind of a desperate drug addict. That seems to be the stereotype. But very often they are organised gangs. So there needs to be a much tougher push on those sort of things. The same with antisocial behaviour. Now, I'm not saying the police do nothing in this regard, but I think they could do more. I would like to see a lot more visible policing. And I'm not talking about PCSOs who have no power of arrest. I mean actual police. Bobby's on the beat. I think the public would greatly welcome this. And honestly, when I see police in Sunderland City Centre, I feel reassured. It's something I like to see. Because it's not guaranteed that there'll be no crime. It's not guaranteed that criminals won't offend in front of them. But I think they are less likely to. Because even if they want to put on a bravado and say, oh, we don't care, they ultimately won't want the hassle of dealing with the police. So visible policing is an extremely important thing. And how can the police do this? They can prioritise crime. They can prioritise doing what the public care about. They really need to get their act together in terms of, you know, drop the virtue signalling, drop getting involved in culture wars, stop policing people's thoughts. Unless someone is really harassing another person, unless they're engaging in antisocial behaviour, like they're yelling out racist taunts or something, you know, throw the book at them. But really, the police have no business getting involved in ideological disputes. They just don't. So I think that they need to really get involved in actual, back to basics policing. By the way, in terms of protesting, I don't blame the police actually for being involved in that, and I know some people would disagree with me on this, but in the case, for example, of the migrant hotel protests, Someone said, why are the police here? Well, guess why. Last year we had Yobs threatening to burn down buildings. That's why the police are there. So I don't blame the police at all in that regard. With this, I'm on the side of the police. They also say, why are the police escorting one side? I'm not sure that it was escorting. I think it's more about keeping the two sides apart. Honestly, I do think when it comes to protests, that is one of the hardest things that police have to. It's one of their hardest challenges. Again, though, they haven't always helped their own case. The way that British Transport Police handled Just Stop Oil was pathetic, offering them cups of tea and so on. That was some of the worst policing I've ever seen. So, the police have to think this is what the public want. They want to see visible policing, but for the right things, not harassing someone over having an opinion that isn't, aggressive or anything that could be reasonably construed as a criminal offence. This is an area that I feel very strongly about. Tougher penalties for young offenders. The reality is, young offenders themselves believe that their age will protect them. Now, I accept that a young offender, a 15 or 16-year-old, is not going to get the same sentence as an adult, but we have a contradiction here. The government has just said that 16-year-olds can now vote. So that is acknowledging that they are mature enough to take the decision of voting people into power. Surely it's a contradiction, therefore, to say that a 16-year-old teenager is a child. I have a problem actually with calling teenagers children because they are starting to develop a lot more. They are starting to do things legally at that age. You could get a driving license. You could join the armed forces at 16. There's things you can do at those ages that children can't do. So when I hear a 17-year-old child was convicted for assaulting someone, spare me. A 17-year-old may technically not be an adult, but don't tell me a 17-year-old's a child. So I think we need to change some of the language in that as well. If you're old enough to act a hard man and go around assaulting people, you're old enough to be punished. So I do think there needs to be tougher penalties for young offenders because they're complacent. They think they could do whatever they want. I mentioned the case recently of the judge in Liverpool who thought he was being tough because he said that the young offender who brought a machete into a public place was arrogant. So you think, okay, this is a judge that actually is on the side of common sense. But did he give him a custodial sentence? No, he gave him a community sentence. So again, judges are detached. But that's a very important thing. Young offenders in this country feel they can get away with everything. There's far too many excuses made for them. I think there needs to be tougher consequences for young offenders. I'm not saying send them to adult jails. I'm saying give them longer sentences, give them tougher sentences, tougher consequences. I do not accept that if someone commits a heinous crime at 15, they should be out of prison at 21. No. Why should they get to enjoy the rest of their lives? Because if they're going to do that at 15, they're going to do just as... I can't see them being a good adult unless it's unless they've served a really long sentence first and then you talk about rehabilitation. But there's a real dangerous trajectory here where we have young offenders doing heinous things and they're not getting sufficient punishments. The cat torturers in London, sorry, I should have put disclaimer for that. But yeah, the two teenagers found torturing kittens. The boy got a year. I think the girl got a suspended sentence. Is that really a deterrent? I'm not sure that it is. Dangerous driving is the same thing. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's made a genuine mistake, like took a wrong turn or something. I'm talking about drunk drivers. I'm talking about people using drugs, going down the motorway in the wrong way. People who have already had numerous driving offences. And again, this often is very young drivers. If someone is killed or seriously injured, the driver will get a custodial sentence, but often it doesn't really correspond with what's happened. I think of the teenager in Norfolk who got just 2 years for paralysing a woman. Now, her whole life has been affected. He got 2 years for that. And he gets to drive again. I don't really accept this argument that someone who kills or seriously injured should ever be allowed to drive again. I know what the argument is. It's to stop them doing it illegally. But it sends out the message that they're effectively being rewarded. They're getting to drive again. Driving is a privilege, not an automatic right. So, driving comes with responsibility. I take the view, if you've killed someone or seriously injured someone through your own selfishness, you should never be allowed behind a wheel again, ever. So that's something that has to change. Or at least, at the very least, if that isn't going to change, let's say longer sentences if you kill or seriously injure someone. Deport foreign offenders. Now, this is something the government has just recently vowed that it's going to do. And yes, it's a popular stance, but you know what? It is a justified stance. If someone has been granted asylum in this country, they should be grateful that they are escaping the persecution or the conflict that they said they are escaping. If they then commit a crime in this country, that's kind of showing disrespect to the country that's given them refuge. So there's not really any moral argument why they should be allowed to stay. There will be some who say that every illegal migrant has committed an offence by being illegal. I'm sorry, I don't see coming over in a boat as being in the same category as a sexual offence or a violent offence. I just don't. It's a different sort of situation. But I do think that migrants who commit serious crimes should be immediately deported. And if the courts stand in the government's way, the public have a right to be angry with the courts, and the government has a right to turn attention on those courts. Those courts need to explain to the public why they're putting the public at risk. So that's something the government's announced, but words are cheap. Right, more accountability from the legal establishment. This is something I feel very strongly about. I do believe the legal establishment, judges, the sentencing council, and legislators are detached. Now, in the case of legislators, they are politicians. They have to get elected, so perhaps less in that area. But judges don't have to get elected. They can afford to be consistently soft and get away with it, really. Because, like I say, the only way the public have any voice in that is we can write to the Attorney General to refer a case to the Court of Appeal. But more often than not, it is not overturned. So I would like to see more pressure, frankly, on the courts. I would like to see more accountability from judges who are consistently soft. I appreciate this may be the hardest one to change, because I'm talking about changing deeply institutionalized setups. There's been trickling changes. For example, we now see televised sentencing. That's something. It brings a little bit more of a visceral point for the public to say, okay, that's the sentence that's been given, that's the reason why. That's a relatively new development, and to be fair, that was Dominic Raab who brought that in, so credit to Dominic Raab. I actually think Raab was one of our better Justice Secretaries in recent years. I believe in giving credit where credit's due. So that was something that was positive. But, it's only a minor thing. It doesn't change the sentencing itself. Victims have had more say in parole hearings. That's a good thing. That's welcome. But I do think that the legal establishment is arrogant. I think the Sentencing Council are very complacent. They're not elected. They have a whole section, like I said in the previous video, sentencing myths. So they're complacent. They think... I genuinely don't think they understand the depth of anger the public feels. Or if they do understand it, they simply don't care. Because if they did care, we would see an increase in sentencing. But this also is down to politicians. Politicians can look at the starting points and the finishing points of sentencing, and the starting points have to be significantly tougher than they currently are. That is a big problem. Judges say their hands are tied. Okay, well, make it so that their hands aren't tied. Have tougher starting points. That should be something that should be considered. I spoke earlier about policing. Well, I really believe that dropping non-crime hate incidents can free up police resources. And you know what? There will still be the mechanisms to tackle things like harassment. If someone, for instance, is being racially abused or sexually harassed, that can already be tackled. I just don't see any need for non-crime hate incidents. I mean, for one thing, it's that word hate. Hate's a very loaded term. And we're seeing that designated in cases where someone has simply had a difference of opinion. It's absurd. So someone's being painted as a hateful, vitriolic person when maybe all they have done is ask a question. This is clearly absurd. And then, the police say that we can't be everywhere at once. Well, they can at least do more if they're not prioritising this. So I do have a big problem with that. The Liberal Democrats, disappointingly, are not supporting abolishing them altogether, although they said in the correspondence I had that they think the police should get, prioritise what the public want. But I just believe so long as non-crime hate incidents exist as something the police can turn to, the police are going to use it. The police have a lot to answer for in terms of public reassurance, because they can say, look, we do arrest criminals, we do arrest thugs who assault people, etc., etc. But like I say, if they don't understand how angry the public get at wasting, overzealous policing or wasting the power that they have, if they don't understand that, if they don't do something to change it, then they can have, I'd make this analogy, they can have 10, 20 examples of officers apprehending criminals. If they have just one incident where the public think, what on earth are you doing? That's common sense. That is what people are going to focus on. Maybe it's unfair, but the police have to understand the optics of that. And I'm not sure that they do. I think too many chief superintendents, they only apologise because there's media attention. And even then, it's half-hearted. There's no pledge of this will not happen again. So I think the police, the problem we have in this country is we have criminals, public, police. The public and the police should be on the same side. Right now, a lot of the public just don't have faith in the police. So it has to change. And the police can't just blame politicians for that, being populist, or the media for reporting it. They have to seriously look at themselves and think, are we making the right priorities here? And I think more often than not, they aren't. So the police have to stop making excuses and recognise why the public feels like this. If early release has to happen because of the prison population situation, then at least there should be tougher community sentencing. Okay, so if you're going to release someone a third of the way into their term, and the Justice Secretary has spoken about this, at least make sentencing far tougher, because the public perception of community sentencing is that it's soft. Well, if that's more visceral, I would even have something to shame the offender, make them wear a bib saying, I am an offender, I am paying a price. It might sound punitive, but you know what? It would be a big deterrent. The offender will not want to go through that experience again. They might even prefer to be in prison. So if you have a much tougher community sentencing, then that may be an option. Because, again, the Sentencing Council don't like this term, walked away from jail free, because they would point out, but it's not totally free, they're getting a community sentence. Yes, but a community sentence isn't a custodial sentence. So let's make community sentencing tougher. And finally, more balanced reporting. And this one might surprise people, but I agree with what Mark Wallace said. I do think the media has a responsibility to report positive things, to report when there has been significant reductions in the sort of crimes that people care about. Because people's mental health is affected. The quality of life is affected, not just by crime itself, but also the fear of crime. And in that regard, yes, it doesn't help that the police are failing to arrest thieves going into shops. But I do think the media, they need to balance it out a bit more. I am not saying they shouldn't report the negative stuff, that's important. But they frankly should also report 30% drop in this London borough in this particular type of crime. 50% less homicides in this point, and so on and so on. So I do think the media can play a role in being a bit more balanced. But that's, in the end of the day, newspapers are also a business. And the tabloid editors know full well that a depressing story that will enrage the public sells more than one that doesn't. But is it ethical? I'm not sure that it is. So those are all the things that I think can help improve our justice system. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to please everyone, but it can significantly improve. It can. And I think a big part of it is making the system more accountable. I think that for much of the public, rightly or wrongly, the perception is that judges are distant figures, that they're kind of living in a bubble, they're living on another planet, that the Court of Appeal is on another planet. I think, the perception is that judges and other people who are making the decisions in this, that they just seem detached. They seem like they are not experiencing what the public is experiencing. And they might argue with that, but they have failed to reassure the public, and they need to understand why they have failed. I mean, I would challenge the Sentencing Council. Do you take any responsibility for the fact that so few people have trust in the criminal justice system? Do you take any responsibility for that? Instead of condescending the public and saying, oh, you're misinformed, why don't you actually reflect and think, could some of this actually be because there is a detachment? You know, on the sentencing myths section, they say judges deal with cases every day that affect the public. Well, yes, they do, but their sentencing too often is disproportionate to the offence. And I don't really accept that it's because their hands are tied. If judges themselves really feel that way, they could be a lot more outspoken and proactive in changing it. Judges can put pressure on the Sentencing Council. They can say, look, give me the tools to put criminals behind bars. So I don't think judges can really complain about their hands being tied if they're not simultaneously trying to do something to change that. So yeah, these are all things that can improve. But one positive thing to close on. Really, really, Britain is not that dangerous. If you're living in a housing estate that's racked by antisocial behaviour, you'll have a very different perspective, and I understand that. But the average British citizen, it's unlikely that you're going to be a victim of crime. That's the truth. And that is a positive thing. So again, like what Mark Wallace was talking about, the perception of crime isn't necessarily the same as what is actually happening. But the sort of crimes that are visceral, the police need to be a lot more proactive. Shop theft, antisocial behaviour and so on. Let me know your thoughts. If you'd like to add anything to this, please do.